The laughter that erupted in the officers' club at Fort Braxton military base was not a sound of mirth. It was a weapon. It cracked through the hushed, reverent atmosphere of the room like a volley of cannon fire, causing the crystal goblets on the polished mahogany tables to rattle in sympathetic vibration. It was a sound designed to diminish, to crush, to put someone in their place. Are you serious, girl? Colonel Marcus Steele, a man whose authority was as starched and rigid as his uniform, leaned forward in his plush leather armchair. His pale blue eyes, the color of a winter sky, sparkled with a cruel, predatory amusement. He was a lion, and a very small, very unwelcome lamb had just wandered into his den. The lamb was a 12-year-old girl named Maya Johnson. She stood alone before the colonel's impromptu court, a small, straight-backed figure surrounded by a dozen senior officers. She maintained the perfect military posture her father had taught her, her small fists clenched at her sides, one hand holding tightly to a yellowed, creased envelope on the thin fabric of her simple dress. Her father's Medal of Honor, Sergeant David Johnson's, hung silently. It was a heavy weight on her skinny chest, a cold, metallic reminder of why she was standing there, in that crucible of contempt, facing a phalanx of powerful men who looked at her as if she were an unwanted, insignificant insect that had crawled in from the dirt. "Sir, I would like to request permission to use the firing range today," Maya repeated, her voice a marvel of control. It was steady, clear, and respectful, though her hands, hidden at her sides, trembled imperceptibly. "It's the 3rd anniversary of my father's death in combat. I wanted to honor him by practicing my marksmanship, just as he taught me before he left for his last mission." Colonel Steele let out a great, booming laugh, even louder this time. He slammed his meaty hand down on the table with such force that the other officers' whiskey glasses swayed dangerously, the amber liquid sloshing against the crystal. "Did you hear that, gentlemen?" he roared, his face flushed with the pleasure of his own perceived wit. "The little girl thinks she knows how to shoot. What's next? She'll be wanting to fly our F-22 Raptors, too." The other officers, a chorus of sycophants and bullies, dutifully joined in the laughter. Some of them whispered poisonous, cutting comments that Maya heard with perfect clarity but pretended not to. "Children should be playing with dolls, not guns," muttered Major Thompson, a man with a perpetually florid face and a reputation for being a bully on the golf course and in the briefing room. "Little girls belong in school, learning to bake cookies, not messing around with military-grade hardware," added Captain Williams, a younger, more ambitious officer who was eager to curry favor with the colonel. His comment elicited a fresh wave of cruel, braying laughter. What Colonel Marcus Steele didn't know, what none of these powerful, arrogant men could possibly know, was the secret that Maya Johnson held in her heart. It was a secret forged in love, grief, and thousands of hours of silent, painstaking practice. They didn't know that her father, Sergeant David Johnson, had not been just an ordinary soldier. He had been a legend. For 6 consecutive years, from the time Maya was 6, until the day he deployed for the last time, he had been her private, dedicated instructor. Every afternoon after school, every Saturday and Sunday morning, while other children were watching cartoons or playing video games, Maya had been training. She had been training with a man who secretly held the unofficial record for the best marksman on the entire base, a record that was whispered about with awe and reverence among the most experienced soldiers, but never officially recognized because David Johnson had always been too humble, too focused on the mission, to care about accolades. 3 years ago, when the tears were still fresh on her cheeks and the pain of her loss was a physical, piercing agony in her chest, Maya had stood before her father's grave, a simple white stone covered by the crisp folds of the American flag, and she had made a promise. It was a whispered promise, a secret covenant between a heartbroken daughter and her fallen hero. It was a promise that no one else had heard, but one that she carried like a burning, sacred flame in the deepest chamber of her heart. It was that promise that had fueled every single day of the secret, relentless training she had undertaken since then. "Listen here, girl," Colonel Steele said, his voice dropping to a low, menacing growl. He stood up, his large frame unfolding, from the chair, and walked around the table with slow, deliberately intimidating steps. His imposing figure cast a long dark shadow over Maya, but she did not flinch. "This is a military installation, not a playground. This is a place for serious men to do serious business. Guns are not toys, and our state-of-the-art firing range is certainly not a place for children to play soldier. Now, you go home, watch some cartoons, and let the adults take care of the important matters." The humiliation burned Maya's cheeks. Like a hot iron, the injustice of it, the sheer, unadulterated cruelty, was a bitter taste in her mouth. But she took a deep, steadying breath, feeling something familiar, something powerful, begin to grow inside her. It was not pure, hot anger. It was something much more potent, much more controlled. It was the icy, unshakable calm that her father had taught her to cultivate in the face of adversity. It was the same calm she had summoned when teachers had doubted her intelligence because of the color of her skin, when classmates had mocked her quiet determination, when the world had tried, again and again, to diminish her. With all due respect, sir, she replied, her voice carrying a strange, preternatural serenity that made some of the officers in the room stop laughing for a moment. I have all the necessary documentation. I have a letter of proper supervision approved by the Military Family Affairs Department. All of the security requirements as outlined in the base regulations have been met. My request is entirely within the rules. Major Peterson, a man sitting to the colonel's right, nearly choked on his whiskey. Well, I'll be, he sputtered, wiping his mouth with the back of his hand. The little girl knows the regulations. How cute. More laughter echoed through the room, but this time it was a little more subdued. Some of the officers were beginning to seem slightly uncomfortable with the prolonged, relentless cruelty of the moment. It was then that Maya's eyes met Colonel Steele's for the first time. She did not look away. She held his gaze with a full, unwavering intensity, and something in that look a quiet, profound, unyielding determination. It contained strength that seemed far too large to fit in the small body of a girl. Made his arrogant, cruel smile falter for a split second. It was the same look that seasoned war veterans carried in their eyes. It was a serenity that only exists in those who have faced far worse storms and have lived to tell the tale. Colonel, irritated by his own momentary hesitation, shook his head with a theatrical, dismissive disdain. You're a stubborn little thing, aren't you? He said. Very well. Since you insist on making a fool of yourself, how about we make this interesting, a little test? He leaned in, his face close to hers, his voice a low, conspiratorial whisper that was meant to be heard by everyone in the room. If you can hit at least 3 out of 10 targets at 50 meters, I will personally sign your authorization. But when you fail, and you will fail, miserably, I want you to promise me that you will never again bother important men with these childish, ridiculous fantasies. Do we have a deal? Maya felt something hot and fierce ignite in her chest, but she kept her face a mask of calm impassivity. I accept your proposal, sir, she said, her voice clear and firm. There, in that room, in front of all those looks of contempt and mockery, she stood firm, a small solitary soldier guarding a secret too powerful, too precious, to be revealed before the perfect, calculated moment. What those men, in their blindness and their arrogance, didn't know was that Maya Johnson wasn't there just to honor her father. She was there to fulfill a promise, and in doing so, she was about to turn the most painful, public humiliation of her life into the most epic, unforgettable demonstration of skill and courage that this military base, and the entire United States Army, would ever witness. Colonel Steele's predatory smile widened, the expression of a shark that smells blood. In the water, perfect, he boomed, turning to his audience. Let everyone witness this important lesson, a lesson in knowing one's place. He gestured theatrically to the other officers, a ringmaster summoning his clowns. Gentlemen, let's head to the firing range. Let's go watch a child learn a thing or two about reality. Major Thompson stood up, rubbing his hands together with a cruel, gleeful anticipation. This is going to be better than a movie, he chortled. I give her 2 minutes. The little girl will run out of there, crying before she can even figure out how to hold the gun right. The other officers laughed like a pack of hyenas, their imaginations already painting a vivid picture of the public humiliation that was to come. As they walked through the long, sterile corridors of the base, Maya kept a few steps behind the boisterous group of officers. She listened to every poisonous comment they made, every whispered joke, every snide remark. They didn't even bother to lower their voices. They wanted her to hear. I bet she faint at the first shot, whispered Captain Williams to a colleague, or she start crying for her mummy. The other man replied, and they both snickered. What none of them knew, what they couldn't possibly imagine, was that Maya had been to that very same firing range hundreds of times before. For 3 years, ever since her father's death, she had secretly made her way to the range every Saturday morning at 5:30 a.m., when the base was still shrouded in darkness and silence. The head of maintenance, an old grizzled war veteran, named Sergeant Miller, who had served with David Johnson in his first tour, would quietly open the gate for her. It was an unspoken agreement, a silent pact between two people who understood the true meaning of honoring the dead. When they arrived at the firing range, the vast open space was empty, except for the rows of targets, standing like silent sentinels. In the distance, Colonel Steele, with a grand sweeping gesture, pointed to a long table where several standard-issue weapons lay, gleaming under the harsh fluorescent lights. "Pick your tool of humiliation, little girl," he said, his voice dripping with sarcasm. "I'd recommend the lightest one. Maybe you'll at least be able to hold it without dropping it on your foot." Maya walked to the table with the same preternatural calm she had shown in the officers' club. Her long, slender fingers ran over the cool metal of the available weapons, her touch light and sure. She bypassed the smaller, lighter pistols and rifles, her hand finally settling on a Glock 19. It was the exact same model her father had used to teach her the basics of shooting when she was only 7 years old. "An interesting choice," Colonel Steele commented, with a tone of feigned academic interest. "At least you have good taste. You'll fail with style." More laughter echoed through the group of officers, but some of the enlisted soldiers, who had begun to gather at a respectful distance, drawn by the rumors that were already beginning to spread through the base, seemed less convinced of the amusement. They watched the small, silent girl with a growing sense of curiosity and respect. Sergeant Rodriguez, the base's head shooting instructor, a man with a face like a roadmap of old battles and a quiet, professional demeanor, approached the group. He had served with David Johnson. He knew the man's legendary, almost mythical reputation as a marksman. He looked at Maya, then at the smirking officers, and his expression was one of deep, profound discomfort. "Colonel," he said, his voice respectful but firm, "perhaps we should consider some additional supervision for the minor. Base regulations are very clear on this." "Nonsense." Sergeant Colonel Steele cut him off abruptly, his tone sharp and dismissive. "The girl wants to play soldier, so we'll let her learn like real soldiers. No coddling, no hand-holding." His voice carried a particular brand of cruelty that made even some of his own loyal subordinates frown. Maya, ignoring the exchange, picked up the Glock 19, and then she did something that made Sergeant Rodriguez blink twice. She checked the weapon. Her movements were so fluid, so professional, so utterly devoid of hesitation, that it was like watching a seasoned pro. She ejected the magazine, checked the chamber, tested the trigger, sighted down the barrel. Every movement was executed with the smooth, automatic precision of someone who had performed that same routine thousands upon thousands of times. Well, Colonel Steele murmured, his amusement now tinged with a faint, almost imperceptible note of surprise. "Looks like Daddy taught you a few basic tricks before." "Well, before he wasn't around to protect you anymore." The cruel, deliberate comment about her father's death was like a knife in Maya's heart. For a single, fleeting moment, she felt a surge of pure, white-hot rage. But then, she remembered her father's words. "Anger is a storm, princess. It can be powerful, but it will blind you. Calm as a river. It's quiet, but it can cut through mountains." She took a deep breath. And then, something unexpected, something profound, happened. Maya closed her eyes for a few seconds, and when she reopened them, everyone present who was paying close attention could see a subtle but undeniable transformation. The nervous, intimidated 12-year-old girl had vanished. In her place stood something else, something much more focused, something much more dangerous. "Ready when you are, sir," Maya said, her voice now carrying an icy, unshakable confidence that made some of the veteran soldiers present look at each other with a dawning sense of recognition. It was the same tone that experienced soldiers used in the moments just before they were about to carry out impossible, life-or-death missions. Colonel Steele positioned himself behind her, his arms crossed over his broad chest, a smug, confident smile still plastered on his face. He was surrounded by his loyal coterie of officers, who were now whispering bets among themselves on how many shots she would miss. "All right, little girl," the colonel announced, his voice booming across the range. 10 shots. The target is at 50 meters. Remember, you only need to hit 3 to win our little agreement. It should be easy, even for you, especially for someone with your family training." What those arrogant blind men didn't know was that David Johnson hadn't just been a good marksman. He had been the unofficial, secret instructor for the best snipers on the base. He was the man that other elite soldiers, the Green Berets, the Delta Force operators, turned to when they needed to improve their skills, to find that extra edge for missions where a single millimeter could be the difference between life and death. And Maya, his daughter, his prodigy, had absorbed every lesson, every technique, every secret he had learned in 2 decades of distinguished military service. More importantly, they didn't know about the 4,847 hours. That was the number of hours Maya had spent training over the past 3 years. Every Saturday morning, every holiday, every free moment she had. All of it dedicated to honoring her father's memory by becoming something he would be proud to see. When Maya took up her shooting position, something in the atmosphere of the range seemed to change. The wind, which had been gusting intermittently, seemed to die down. The laughter of the officers ceased, replaced by a tense, expectant silence, and even Colonel Steele, in his fortress of arrogance, felt a strange, inexplicable chill run down his spine, as if he was standing on the edge of a precipice, about to witness something that would fundamentally change his understanding of the world. Each new taunt, each cruel, dismissive comment, had not broken her. It had only fueled something deep inside her, something her oppressors, in their blindness, could not see. A silent, unyielding strength, being forged and tempered by the very injustice they sought to impose. What those privileged, powerful men didn't know was that every act of contempt, every word of scorn, was another line in the writing of their own sentence of humiliation. And Maya Johnson was about to become the executioner of that long delayed justice. Maya assumed the shooting position, and her movements were so fluid, so economical, so utterly professional, that Sergeant Rodriguez, the instructor, felt a profound sense of déjà vu. He frowned, his brow furrowed in concentration. There was something deeply uncannily familiar about that stance. The way her feet were positioned, with a military precision that spoke of endless repetition. The way her shoulders were aligned, perfectly square to the target. The slow, controlled rhythm of her breathing. It was like watching a ghost from the past take shape before his very eyes. It was the exact stance of Sergeant David Johnson. "What are you waiting for, little girl?" Colonel Steele taunted, his voice echoing across the nascent field like a dissonant, ugly tuning fork. "Maybe you need some help holding the gun, or do you want someone to point out which end the bullet comes out of?" The other officers, taking their cue from their leader, snickered like a pack of well-fed hyenas, thoroughly satisfied with their own wit. Maya ignored them. She closed her eyes for 3 seconds, exactly as her father had taught her to do. "Take a deep breath, princess," his voice echoed in her memory, as clear and as comforting as if he were standing right beside her. "Feel the wind on your face. Listen to the silence between your heartbeats. The perfect shot doesn't happen when you pull the trigger. It happens in that moment of absolute stillness." Just before, when she opened her eyes again, something had completely, irrevocably changed in the atmosphere of the firing range. Several soldiers who had been passing by on their way to other duties had now stopped to watch, drawn by the strange, palpable energy that was emanating from the small, solitary figure standing in the firing line. It was as if an invisible switch had been flipped, and a low, powerful current was now humming in the air, ready when you give the signal. "Sir," Maya said, her voice carrying a supernatural, almost unnerving calm that made even Colonel Steele hesitate for a fraction of a second before he barked his next command. It was then that Sergeant Rodriguez, unable to remain a passive observer any longer, approached the colonel discreetly. Rodriguez was a veteran of 3 brutal tours in Afghanistan. He had served under David Johnson during the most dangerous, most harrowing operation of his entire career, a mission from which not all of them had returned. Rodriguez knew, with an absolute bone-deep certainty, exactly who had trained this goal, and he knew what that meant for the arrogant, clueless men who were about to receive the lesson of their lives. "Colonel," Rodriguez said, his voice respectful but firm, a quiet warning that the colonel was too arrogant to hear. "Perhaps we should consider using proper hearing protection. For everyone present. For safety." Colonel Steele looked at him with open irritation. "Sergeant, it's just 10 shots. From a scared little kid, we don't need to enact full military protocol to watch a spectacular failure in the making." Rodriguez nodded silently, but he positioned himself strategically, a few feet behind Maya, where he could intervene, if necessary. He knew something that no one else there knew. David Johnson hadn't just been an exceptional soldier. He had been the unofficial, secret instructor for the base's most lethal, most elite snipers. He was the man that other veterans, the quiet professionals, sought out when they needed to learn the techniques that could save their lives, and the lives of their comrades, in the hell of a combat zone. "All right, little girl," Colonel Steele announced, his voice booming with a renewed, cruel amusement. "You have 60 seconds. For your 10 shots, your time starts now." Maya's first shot echoed across the field like a dry, precise thunderclap. Before the echo had even faded, the second shot followed, with a cadence, a rhythm, that made several of the veteran soldiers standing nearby straighten up. It was the rhythm of someone who had fired not hundreds, but thousands upon thousands of rounds through his high-powered binoculars. Sergeant Rodriguez watched the target with a growing sense of admiration and a dawning, professional terror. "My God," he whispered to himself, his voice barely audible. "She's better than her father was." Colonel Steele was still laughing when the third shot rang out, but his laughter was beginning to sound a little forced, a little strained. There was something about the relentless, methodical precision of those shots that didn't quite match whose expectations of a public, tearful humiliation. "Well, at least she's quick about it," Major Thompson commented, trying to keep the note of mockery in his voice, but failing. "Maybe she just wants to get the embarrassment over with as soon as possible." What they didn't know was that Maya had spent the last 3 years not only practicing her shooting but studying the science of it. She had studied ballistics, windage, the effects of temperature and humidity on a bullet's trajectory. She had studied every movement, every breath, every heartbeat, with the obsessive focus of a scientist. For 1,095 consecutive days, she had woken up at 5 a.m. to practice at a makeshift range she had built behind her small house, using paper targets taped to old gnarled trees. More importantly, they didn't know about the 847 hours. That was the number of hours of dedicated mental training Maya had developed. She had learned concentration techniques from old Zen masters' books, visualization exercises from sports psychology manuals, breathing methods from yoga instructors. She had trained her mind to be able to completely block out all external distractions and enter a state of profound, absolute focus, a state that most trained soldiers took years, even decades, to achieve. The fourth, fifth, and sixth shots followed, with a relentless, mechanical precision that began to cause uneasy whispers to spread among the growing crowd of observers. Even the officers who had been so loudly mocking her just a few minutes before began to exchange nervous, uncertain glances. "It's taking too long to check the target," muttered Captain Williams, his previous cocksure confidence beginning to waver, to crumble at the edges. Sergeant Rodriguez knew exactly why no one was rushing to check the first results. Some of the more experienced veterans present, the ones with ears tuned by years of combat, had already recognized the sound. It was a distinctive, metallic ping, a sound that only happens when a bullet strikes the exact, dead center of a metal target. Maya continued to fire, her movements a symphony of controlled, disciplined grace. Each shot followed the previous one with perfectly timed, perfectly measured intervals. There was no rush, no anxiety, just the systematic, relentless execution of a skill that had been forged and honed through years of quiet, solitary, passionate dedication. The seventh shot made Colonel Steele stop laughing completely. The eighth made several of his officers stop whispering. The ninth created an absolute, profound silence that spread across the entire firing range like an invisible, powerful wave. When Maya prepared for the 10th and final shot, something extraordinary, something that only a true master of the art would even notice, happened. Instead of aiming directly at the target, she adjusted her position slightly, a minuscule, almost imperceptible shift of her body, compensating for a sudden gust of wind that no one else had even felt. It was the kind of instinctive, subconscious adjustment that only the truly exceptional marksmen, the naturals, made automatically. The last shot echoed across the field with a sharp, clean finality that seemed to announce that something important, something historic, had just happened. Maya lowered her gun with the same fluid, practiced movements, engaged a safety catch, and turned to face Colonel Steele directly. 10 shots complete. "As requested, sir," she said, her voice a model of perfect military formality. For the first time since he had arrived at the firing range, Colonel Steele looked genuinely, profoundly uncertain about what he had just witnessed. There was something about Maya's calm, quiet confidence that did not match the script of public humiliation he had so carefully, and so cruelly, planned. Sergeant Rodriguez approached, his own high-powered binoculars in hand, preparing to officially verify what everyone in that crowd already suspected, but what no one, especially the officers, wanted to admit out loud. The veteran instructor had seen many, many exceptional marksmen throughout his long and distinguished career, but he had never, ever witnessed anything that so completely, so fundamentally, challenged his own understanding of what was humanly possible. What those arrogant blind men didn't know was that Maya Johnson hadn't come to that firing range just to fulfill a humiliating agreement. She had come to prove that some legacies, some promises, are greater than the small, petty people who try to diminish them. She had come to prove that true strength, The kind that can move mountains, often grows in the very places where others see only apparent and contemptible weakness. When Sergeant Rodriguez focused his high-powered binoculars on the target 50 meters away, his face, a weathered canvas of old battles and long years, went pale. It was a pallor that was so sudden, so absolute, that it made even Colonel Steele feel a strange, cold chill run down his spine. It was as if the veteran instructor had just witnessed something that defied not just his experience, but his very understanding of the laws of physics. The silence that had followed Maya's last shot was so deep, so profound, that everyone on that range could hear the faint, lonely sound of the wind whispering through the flags on the base. Rodriguez kept his binoculars focused on the target, his expression slowly, almost comically, changing from professional curiosity to utter, slack-jawed disbelief, and then to something that looked almost like Reverend Sergeant Rodriguez. Colonel Steele said, his voice a forced, unnatural attempt at casualness, a voice that carried a clear rising note of anxiety. "What's the result? I'm sure we can start preparing that lesson on reality for our young friend here." Rodriguez slowly, deliberately, lowered his binoculars. His face was as pale as a sheet. For a few long, agonizing seconds, he simply stared at Maya, his expression, a complex, unreadable mixture of profound admiration and a strange, almost fearful awe. "Colonel," he said, his voice coming out as a hoarse, strangled whisper as if the words themselves were refusing to leave his throat. "I think you need to check this, personally." Colonel Steele's carefully constructed mask of confidence finally began to waver, to crack. "What do you mean, check for myself? How many did she hit? 5, 6? His voice carried the barely concealed, rising desperation of a man who can feel the solid ground beginning to crumble and shift beneath his feet. "Sir," Rodriguez said, holding out the binoculars with hands that were now trembling slightly. "All 10 shots, they—" He paused, shaking his head as if he couldn't quite believe the words he was about to say. "Colonel, you'd better check for yourself." Colonel Steele snatched the binoculars from him roughly, his own hands suddenly unsteady. He raised them to his eyes, his movements jerky and uncertain, and when he focused on the target 50 meters away, his arrogant, cruel expression crumbled. It disintegrated, like a house of cards in a hurricane. What he saw defied not only his expectations, but his entire understanding of the limits of human ability. All 10 of Maya's shots had not only hit the dead center of the target, but they had created a cluster so tight, so impossibly small, that it looked like a single, slightly enlarged hole. It was the kind of accuracy that professional, world-class snipers, men who had spent their entire adult lives honing their craft, fought for years to achieve, and it had just been executed, flawlessly, by a 12-year-old girl, as if it were the most natural, most effortless thing in the world. "That's impossible," Steele muttered, his voice a choked, disbelieving whisper. He lowered the binoculars, then raised them again, checking and rechecking the target, as if he could somehow will the image to change. "It has to be some kind of trick. Faulty equipment. Something." Maya remained silent, her face a mask of calm dignity. She watched the slow, public disintegration of the arrogance that had so cruelly plagued her just a few minutes before. There was no cruel triumph in her expression, no hint of gloating. There was only the quiet, profound satisfaction of someone who had done exactly what she had promised she would do. Major Thompson, his face now a blotchy, unhealthy shade of red, stepped forward and snatched the binoculars from the colonel's trembling hands. He checked for himself. His reaction was even more dramatic. He recoiled as if he had been physically punched. "My God," he breathed, his voice full of a new, grudging respect. "That cluster. It's better than anything I've seen in my 20 years of military service." One by one, all the other officers who had been so quick to mock and jeer, took their turn with the binoculars, and one by one their confident, smug expressions turned to silent, stunned shock. Captain Williams, the man who had so confidently declared that a little girl's place was not on a firing range, was now completely, utterly speechless, confronted with the irrefutable, undeniable proof of the competence he had so arrogantly underestimated. It was then that Sergeant Rodriguez, a man who understood the true meaning of honor and respect, made a decision that would change everything forever. He approached Maya, his posture one of profound, reverential respect, and he said, his voice loud and clear enough for everyone on that range to hear, "Miss Johnson, your father, Sergeant David Johnson, would be the proudest man on this entire planet right now." This demonstration of skill not only honors his memory, but it sets a new, higher standard of excellence for this entire military base. The words, and the public, formal way in which they were delivered, hit Colonel Steele like a volley of bullets. Suddenly, the full, devastating implications of the entire situation crystallized in his mind. He had publicly humiliated, mocked, and belittled the daughter of a decorated war hero, a man who had been killed in combat, a child who, it was now terrifyingly clear, possessed skills that far exceeded those of anyone under his command. Worse, he had done it all in front of dozens of witnesses. Witnesses who were now whispering among themselves, some of them discreetly taking photos with their cell phones. The story would spread throughout the entire base before the day was over, and then it would spread beyond. The colonel who had mocked a grieving, orphaned child, and had been publicly, spectacularly, humiliated by her exceptional, almost supernatural, competence. How? Colonel Steele finally managed to articulate, his voice sounding strange and distant, as if it were coming from someone else. How can a child shoot like that? Maya looked at him then, her gaze direct and unwavering. My father taught me that respect is earned through actions, not through words or rank, she said, her voice quiet but carrying the weight of a profound, simple truth. He taught me that when someone doubts you, when they judge you based on nothing more than their own prejudice, the best response, the only response, is to demonstrate, without anger and without pride, exactly what you are capable of. The devastating, elegant simplicity of her response struck everyone present like a bolt of lightning. Here was a 12-year-old child offering a masterclass in dignity, in competence, in grace under pressure, to a group of senior military officers who were supposed to be her role models, her protectors. Sergeant Rodriguez moved closer, his eyes shining with a mixture of pride and awe. Miss Johnson, he said, your father mentioned to me once that you had natural talents, but he never specified. He never said you were. He paused, searching for the right words, and failing. Would you be interested in demonstrating your skills at longer distances? Maya's eyes, for the first time that day, sparkled with a genuine, childlike interest. What distance did you have in mind, Sergeant? 100 meters, 200, whatever is within your comfort zone. Colonel Steele watched this interaction with a growing, sickening horror, realizing that his public humiliation was only just beginning. The child he had tried to break, to crush, was now about to demonstrate a level of skill that would make his own considerable military competence look amateurish, clumsy. More and more soldiers had now joined the group, drawn by the whispers that were spreading through the base like wildfire. Some of the older veterans approached, their faces full of a genuine, profound respect, recognizing that they were witnessing something special, something historic. Maya checked her weapon once more, her fluid, professional movements a stark, beautiful contrast to the growing nervousness and discomfort of the officers who had so foolishly, so cruelly, underestimated her. Sergeant Rodriguez, she said, her voice clear and confident. 200 meters would be a good next step. It was at that moment that Colonel Steele realized a terrible, immutable truth. Little Maya Johnson hadn't just come to that firing range to prove a point. She had come to teach a lesson about prejudice, about competence, and about the true, enduring meaning of respect. A lesson that none of those present would ever forget. And the lesson, he now understood with a cold, sinking dread, was only just beginning. As new targets were being prepared, at distances that would challenge even the most seasoned professional shooters, a question hung in the tension-filled air. Would Maya continue to surprise them, or would she finally reach the limits of her extraordinary, almost unbelievable, abilities? And more importantly, what other lessons about dignity, about honor, about determination, did this small, quiet, 12-year-old child still have to teach these grown men who thought they knew everything about the world and their own limits? 6 months after the day that would forever be known as the reckoning at Fort Braxton, Maya Johnson walked through the corridors of the base with a new, gold badge hanging around her neck. It read, Junior Precision Marksman Instructor, U.S. Army Exceptional Talent Program. At 13 years old, she had become the youngest person in the long and storied history of the American military to receive such an official, prestigious recognition. That fateful morning had turned into a legendary, almost mythical, demonstration of skill. After the impossible feat at 50 meters, she had, at Sergeant Rodriguez's invitation, proceeded to the 200-meter range, then the 300, the 400, and finally, the 500-meter range. Each new distance had revealed an even more impossible, more breathtaking level of accuracy. The day had culminated in a shot that was now the stuff of legend on the base. She had hit a target the size of a silver dollar at 500 meters. using only the standard iron sights of her Glock 19. When the result was confirmed, some of the old hardened war veterans who had gathered to watch had begun to cry openly, without shame. The video of the demonstration, recorded discreetly by several of the soldiers present, had, as Colonel Steele had feared, gone viral. Titled "Little Girl Humiliates Arrogant Colonel with Impossible Shooting," it had racked up over 47 million views in just 2 weeks. Maya Johnson had become a global symbol of quiet strength, of grace under pressure, of the triumph of competence over prejudice. For Colonel Marcus Steele, the consequences were as devastating as they were definitive. The official military investigation that followed the incident revealed a systematic, long-standing pattern of discriminatory and bullying behavior. Dozens of other military families, emboldened by Maya's courage, came forward with their own accounts of humiliation, of prejudice, of abuse of power. The photographs of him mocking Maya, which had been posted on numerous military social media pages, were now accompanied by captions such as "The man who underestimated a legend" and "This is what arrogance looks like." Steele was formally demoted, stripped of his command, and transferred to an isolated frigid base in Alaska, where he was assigned to mind-numbing basic administrative duties. His planned, glorious military retirement, which was to have been filled with full honors and accolades, turned into a quiet, deeply embarrassing, and ignominious exit. In a final, cruel twist of irony, he now worked under the direct supervision of 2 officers, one black and one Hispanic, who knew his story all too well and who treated him with a cool, professional correctness that was, in its own way, more punishing than any open hostility. Major Thompson and Captain Williams faced official career-stalling reprimands and were required to participate in months of intensive training on diversity, respect, and leadership. Their military careers, which had once seemed so bright and promising, never fully recovered from the stain of having so enthusiastically participated in the public humiliation of a child. Maya, on the other hand, flourished in ways that no one, not even she, could have predicted. The Pentagon, recognizing the immense public relations victory she represented, but also her genuine, undeniable talent, created a special, one-of-a-kind program that allowed her to combine her regular school studies with advanced military training. Elite universities, from MIT to Stanford, began a fierce competition for her future admission, offering full, unconditional scholarships. Military equipment companies, seeing a marketing goldmine, wanted to sponsor her development, to put her face on their products. More importantly, she had inspired an entire generation. Children from marginalized communities all over the country, all over the world, sent her letters, emails, and drawings, telling her how her story had motivated them to pursue their own dreams, dreams that had once seemed impossible. Young black girls, in particular, saw her as a hero, as living, breathing proof that competence, dedication, and determination were far more powerful than any prejudice. Sergeant Rodriguez, who had been promoted to staff sergeant for his exemplary, courageous conduct during the incident, became Maya's official mentor and one of her closest friends. "Your father," he told her one afternoon, as he watched her train a new group of young recruits who listened to her every word with a mixture of awe and absolute reverence, "would be bursting with pride right now. But I think he would be even prouder of the woman of character you are becoming." The firing range where it had all begun was officially renamed the Sergeant David Johnson Memorial Firing Range. A bronze plaque was installed at the entrance, telling the story of that transformative day, serving as a permanent, powerful reminder that excellence can, and often does, emerge from the most unexpected of places. Maya still visited her father's grave every Saturday morning, but now she no longer cried. Instead, she would sit by the cool stone and tell him about her week. She would tell him about her new records, her academic achievements, and the new barriers of prejudice she had broken down. "I did it, Dad," she would always whisper at the end of her visit. I showed them what we're capable of." The entire culture of Fort Braxton had changed. Zero-tolerance policies for discrimination and harassment were implemented. With a new, fierce seriousness, talent identification programs in underserved communities became a top priority for the base command. Maya's story was now told in every leadership training session, a powerful real-world example of how prejudice can blind people to extraordinary, game-changing potential. The most profound irony of all, of course, was that Colonel Steele had inadvertently created the exact opposite of what he had so cruelly intended. Instead of humiliating and breaking Maya, he had given her the perfect platform on which to shine, in front of an audience of witnesses who would never ever forget what they had seen. His clumsy, brutal attempt to diminish her had become the catalyst for the greatest, most positive transformation in the history of the base. In a television interview 6 months later, a poised, articulate Maya was asked if she held a grudge against Colonel Steele. Her response revealed a wisdom and a grace that was far beyond her years. "He gave me the greatest gift anyone could have given me," she said, her voice clear and steady. "He gave me the opportunity to prove him, and everyone who thinks like him, wrong. Sometimes our greatest opponents end up being our best teachers, even if they don't mean to be." Maya Johnson had learned the most valuable lesson of all. The best revenge is not to destroy those who have tried to diminish you, but to grow so large, so strong, so undeniably excellent, that your achievements become impossible for anyone to ignore. She had taken their humiliation and turned it into her motivation. She had taken their prejudice and turned it into her fuel, and she had taken their underestimation and turned it into her superpower. The small, quiet girl who had walked into that officers' club, simply asking for permission to honor her fallen father, had become a force of nature, a young woman who had rewritten the rules, not just about marksmanship, but about human potential, about the enduring power of prejudice, and about the beautiful, transformative power of never, ever underestimating someone based on what you think you see.